And welcome to our live continuing coverage of the Democratic National Convention, which this year is in Chicago, and it harkens back to the years in 1968. Now, how long ago was that? You're looking at someone born in 1968, a tumultuous year in politics, and it's the last time the Democrats held their convention in Chicago, and it did not go smoothly then. They're hoping for quite a contrast, even though there are echoes in history from 56 years ago. I'm Chief Investigator Brendan Keefe with Atlanta News First Investigates, and you're watching Atlanta News First Plus, wherever you get us, on YouTube and elsewhere. And this is, again, live streaming coverage. We're going to be doing this all week. We're going to be giving you sort of a recap of what happened the night before. That starts tomorrow. And we're going to be previewing what's coming up during the convention every day. That starts today, of course. And it's a big day because the sort of keynote speaker, if you will, is the person who is supposed to be giving the acceptance speech for the nomination for the Democratic Party. And that, of course, is President Joe Biden. That normally happens on Thursday in the convention. That's tradition for both parties. But this time, of course, he's not the nominee. Echoing 1968, Joe Biden has essentially stepped aside, just like President Johnson did. LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, had stepped aside back in 1968, but he did that in March, not so late in the process. But again, what a tumultuous time this has been in our politics, because when we were talking about the Republican National Convention here, there's Joe Biden. You can see some file video of him there. He's going to be giving a speech tonight, essentially the keynote speech. And it's important to point out why they're having Joe Biden do this. This is Joe Biden saying, I am passing the torch. I am giving my vice president my full-throated endorsement to be the next president of the United States, even though he wanted to stay in the job. He made that decision, obviously, under pressure after that, disastrous, we can say, debate performance where he just wasn't all there. By all accounts, even he said it wasn't his best night. And what you had was a president who'd spent his entire life dedicated to public service, stepping aside even though he wanted to stay in the job. You know, Joe Biden's first convention was in 1972. Think about that. And that's when he was running for U.S. Senate, and it was a long shot bid for U.S. Senate. And of course, he became Senator Joe Biden. And that was after a family tragedy where his wife and child were killed in a car crash. And then he dedicated a life of service to, not only serving Delaware as a U.S. Senator, but then also running for president multiple times, a couple of failed attempts. And then he was vice president, of course, under Barack Obama, and then ascended to the presidency. And he will be a one-term president, really because there's, Father Time is undefeated, as they say. Even though Joe Biden had accomplished much and had a record to run on, he was not able to stay as the top person on the ticket. And the Biden-Harris campaign became the Harris campaign, and now, of course, it is the Harris-Walz campaign. So what do we expect over the next few days? What we expect is a sort of, disciplined messaging on the part of the Democratic Party. What we saw in the Republican National Convention was really an extraordinary Republican convention. I mean, if you joined our streaming session here on Atlanta News First Plus when we were covering that, the Republican convention could not have gone better. And of course, it came right after an attempted assassination of former President Donald Trump. And then J.D. Vance was essentially just announced right then that week of the convention, and that gave them a lot of momentum. They were able to introduce him to quite a bit of enthusiasm. Things have not gone so smoothly for the Republican ticket since that date. Some of their own making, and some because the Democratic ticket changed overnight, basically. When Joe Biden stepped out of the race, you had a 48-hour period where there was all talk of an open convention. Man, that's what happened in 1968. There were riots in the streets. There were riots in the convention hall. Dan Rather famously was roughed up on the floor of the convention. And there were people literally joining the race the week or two before the convention. That's how crazy it got. And where you had, there was talk at that point of Lyndon Johnson actually showing up. They had reserved a helipad for him in Chicago, that if Lyndon Johnson wanted to show up and join the convention, to at least come in and make a speech, that they were prepared to do that. We don't have that. It's not an open convention this time around because Joe Biden, you see there on your screen, has stepped aside very quickly. Support gelled around his vice president, Kamala Harris, and she is now already the nominee because there was a roll call vote that took place before the convention. So the convention is really a formality at this point because she's already the nominee. And her running mate, Tim Walz, is also the nominee for vice president. So that's already settled. What you're going to see essentially is a 4-day infomercial. And it all starts out with the speakers tonight and throughout the week because that's what's going to frame all of this. Joining me now is Joy Lim Nakrin. She's our legal correspondent here and herself a lawyer, but she's going to put on her political hat today. And I know this isn't normally what you talk about, right. but Joy, the speakers really are going to drive, especially in prime time, this convention.
Absolutely. And, you know, as I think you've already mentioned, that the president himself, Joe Biden, is going to be speaking tonight. But we're expected to hear from several very popular former presidents throughout the week. We actually have former President Obama speaking tomorrow at the Democratic National Convention. And then on Wednesday, former President Bill Clinton is going to be speaking along with, of course, Tim Walz, the Minnesota governor who is the presumptive VP nominee as well. And then on Thursday is when we're expecting the nominee, Kamala Harris herself, to actually take the stage and address the Democratic National Convention, becoming the first woman of color to headline a major political party's presidential nomination. And she'll officially accept the nomination on Thursday during that time. And, you know, certainly not without controversy, not without really, you know, conflict, if you will. Just over the weekend, we heard former President Trump kind of renew these attacks on Ms. Harris, on Vice President Harris, to the tune of a coup, essentially alleging that she was anointed through a coup rather than chosen by primary voters. And he said, quote, "This was an overthrow of a president. This was an overthrow," is what he said in a rally. Mr. Trump said in a rally in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania on Saturday, obviously referring to Vice President Harris replacing President Biden on the ticket. And then he later added, quote, "They deposed a president. It was a coup of a president. This was a coup." And you know, we've heard his language, Mr. Trump's language, also about you know, what he describes as really a rigged system, and that often refers to the various legal battles that he has been facing, including here in Fulton County, Georgia. And remember, it's been just a little over a year now since he was first indicted here in Fulton County, Georgia, on charges of election interference, essentially. And, you know, Ms. Willis, DA Willis, had planned on the trial beginning this month, but instead, well, seems that that's a long way off, and the entire case is really on hold and in the Court of Appeals.
He's dodged legal bullets and literal bullets from an attempted assassination. It's extraordinary. But no matter what the former president said in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, there is the matter of the law. Private parties pick their own candidates, and even though there's a primary voting system in place, that isn't prescribed by the Constitution. In fact, there is essentially no federal law indicating how political parties pick their candidates. They're free to do so based on their own rules that they can change at will, right?
Yeah, no, and that's an important point. But, you know, Mr. Trump has a very effective legal team. And if there is any legal basis to make an argument, I am certain that they absolutely will. We've seen that they've been quite effective in essentially delaying the trial here in Fulton County, Georgia, if not putting the entire case in jeopardy. Of course, as I mentioned, you know, it's been sitting in the Georgia Court of Appeals for the moment, and they're reviewing whether, you know, Ms. Willis should even be on the case, whether her office should be on the case after, you know, Mr. Trump's team alleged a conflict of interest, and whether the charges should even stand. So, you know, certainly he's got a very sophisticated legal team, and if there are arguments to be made regarding the alleged coup, I'm sure that they will make their efforts.
Well, he's had a very effective criminal defense team for all of these cases because it has been very effective with delay. You could say he's prevailed in almost every case except for the one for which he will be sentenced next month in New York City. It's only 3 weeks away now that the former president of the United States, current Republican nominee, is going to be sentenced on multiple felonies in New York City. That was for the so-called hush money record keeping, if you will. But he has not had much luck with hiring attorneys to prosecute, if you will, his civil cases alleging election fraud. In fact, some of his attorneys have lost their law licenses, Rudy Giuliani most notably.
That's right.
You've got Jenna Ellis and others who've had to take pleas.
That's
and
right.
under the First Offender Act here in Georgia, for example, Kenneth Chesborough and others have faced essentially their own legal peril for alleging election abuses that essentially the court dismissed in most cases either on procedural or on the merits. And then of course in 2016 Donald Trump alleged that even though he won, he said if I don't win it's rigged, but if I do win it's not rigged. But then when he won, he said that the only reason he didn't win the popular vote was because so many undocumented immigrants had voted and there was no evidence of that. I personally in 2020 tracked down supposedly dead voters alleged by the Trump campaign here in Georgia, and I knocked on their door and they answered alive and well. And so those allegations of dead voters just simply wasn't true.
And that was part of the case. I mean, well, the statements were not the same, but it's sort of along those lines. False allegations, right? Essentially, defamation was the suit that was in which he was found liable, right? Rudy Giuliani was found liable for Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss here in Georgia. So, certainly juries have already found that there were false narratives being spewed by the administration.
Right. But that hasn't stopped him. So tell me, this is really interesting. I mean, at these conventions, especially, they love to trot out the sort of party faithful, but also former presidents. We've got 3 former presidents by my count, or at least 2 former presidents and 1 current president, which is also unusual that you have a current president who isn't running. I don't think in recent memory that's ever happened where there's been a current president, with the exception of Ronald Reagan, who was term limited, and others who were term limited, like Bill Clinton, speaking at the convention. Here we have Joe Biden, who is legally eligible to run for re-election, has chosen not to. The last time that happened was LBJ, and LBJ did not show up to the convention in Chicago. And actually one of the reasons was Secret Service says it simply wasn't safe. That's how unsafe the Chicago convention was 56 years ago. But you also have Hillary Clinton, who was the first woman to lead the top of a major party ticket, and also ran against Donald Trump. So she's certainly got a lot to say. There are several people who know Donald Trump well who are going to be speaking. But I do have one question: is if the message of the Democratic Party is Kamala Harris represents the future tomorrow, Donald Trump represents the past. That's been a big part of their messaging. How does it help to bring out the past when all of these speakers are yesterday and not tomorrow? That's
a really good question. And I'm not a political analyst, so I don't know that I'm qualified to make a comment on that. But you're absolutely right. That is an interesting point. But to that end, you and I were also discussing off camera a little bit. We were a little bit perplexed about just kind of the strategy behind what's happening with the GOP House committees that are now investigating whether to impeach President Biden. Speaking of this kind of past present, because he's obviously an outgoing president at this time. So, what the political strategy is to that, I have questions about that as well.
Well, we know what it was. I mean, probably because we saw it in 2016 with the investigation of Hillary Clinton over Benghazi. I mean, she endured several hours of questioning while she was running for president. And of course, once she lost the election, there wasn't a lot more interest in defeating Hillary Clinton, although it's very interesting. Donald Trump is saying Joe Biden's name a lot on the campaign trail. In fact, he even, at least jokingly, if not seriously, suggested Joe Biden was going to show up in Chicago and sort of take back the nomination, which is impossible to do at this point anyway. He certainly can't change his mind, but it's very clear that Donald Trump wishes he was running against Joe Biden, because he was doing very well against Joe Biden and suddenly finds himself on his back foot. And in many polls, he's behind it a couple of points within the margin of error nationally, and even now in some swing states. So he kind of wishes Joe Biden was still the nominee, but it doesn't make a lot of sense that they're going to go forward with an impeachment of someone who won't be president a year from now, no matter what.
And maybe based on the poll numbers that you've been referring to, maybe part of the strategy is to essentially equate Kamala Harris with Joe Biden.
Smart.
And once that essentially to sort of paint her as kind of a figurehead for President Joe Biden, even if he would no longer officially be the president.
See, Joy, you are a political analyst because because you've hit on actually the challenge for the Harris campaign this whole week and these next several weeks is how do they thread that needle of essentially claiming credit for the best parts of Joe Biden's legacy and denying responsibility for any of the negative things of Joe Biden's legacy. And then also, she's trying to be the young, fresh candidate running against the nearly octogenarian Donald Trump now. And now suddenly age becomes the Democrats' issue instead of the Republicans. It's extraordinary. Joy, thank you so much for joining us. And you really hit the nail on the head. So you now are anointed a political analyst.
But thank you.
Thanks for being here. Appreciate it very much. Speaking of Chicago now, we are going to, in a moment, go to a live report from Doug Reardon, our political reporter, who was also at the Republican convention, and he is now at the Democratic convention in Chicago, and he's got sort of a preview now of what we can expect to see tonight, and then we'll talk to him live on the backside.
With the Democratic National Convention converging on Chicago this weekend, policy issues played out even outside the venue for the event.
I want a real call for a ceasefire.
Rabbi Abby Stein joined the hundreds of demonstrators calling attention to an issue that is hemorrhaging voters from the Democratic Party, the war between Israel and Palestine.
We're here because I want to say not because we have lost hope, even though it sometimes feels like there is very little hope, but we're here also believing that we can actually move the Democratic Party.
While the protests over Palestine remained peaceful, Illinois Governor J.D. Pritzker shared a warning Sunday for anyone coming to the city with the goal of causing trouble.
If there are troublemakers, they're going to get arrested and they're going to get convicted.
This year's DNC, no matter what happens, will be historic, with President Joe Biden stepping down last minute and handing the reins to Vice President Kamala Harris. She'll become the first black woman to ever top a major party ticket.
Kamala Harris, Tim Walz, they're taking us forward. They're taking the American people forward.
And Georgia will have plenty of representation at this year's convention. Congressman Sanford Bishop from Southwest Georgia has been to plenty of conventions before, but says he's never seen the energy this high.
We got a winning ticket. We have a winning combination. We got a team, and I think America has got a brighter day ahead with the Harris-Walz administration.
Doug Reardon, Atlanta News First.
And you say his name, and Doug Reardon appears. Here's Doug live now from Chicago, Illinois. And you don't even have to know where he is because it says so right on the building behind him. I see that in the shot there, Doug. First and foremost, comparing your arrival Monday at the Republican convention and now appearing at the Democratic convention, what's been the difference in the level of security or logistics, just even getting to your live shot location?
Yeah, well, Brendan, obviously the heavy presence of security at the RNC was necessary because of what happened just hours before that convention started with Donald Trump and that assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania. And so over at the United Center, there is still that very heavy security presence. We actually got an email from Chicago police not too long ago spelling out some of the protest routes and also some of the road closures, and it's very similar to what we saw at the Republican National Convention. And so, with events like these, they have a special classification by Secret Service as really high-profile events. It's things like this, the Republican National Convention, inaugurations, things of that nature, where they're really throwing a lot of resources behind these types of security measures. And so that's really what we've seen on top of a very large Chicago police presence. Even at that protest that you saw yesterday in that story that we just showed you, that was right here, and the whole street was lined with armored vehicles, Chicago police. And so, while they are creating an environment where people can protest peacefully, as we saw yesterday, there is still that very looming presence of security here in Chicago, both at our hotel and at the United Center.
Yeah, I covered the 2004 Republican convention in New York City, which is similar in terms of scale of having a large police force, a major city, that kind of thing. And there were a lot of protests against the war in Iraq, and particularly in Iraq. And so there were a tremendous amount of protests at that point. And, you know, there were calls for restraint by the NYPD, and I know there's calls for restraint by the Chicago police, and I've heard about some of the specialized training they've gotten. But you know, even though we're talking 56 years ago, it is hard to say Democratic National Convention in Chicago in the same sentence without seeing those images of police cracking down quite literally on protesters back then. What are they doing to try to avoid that this time?
Well, you mentioned the special training that they're getting, Brendan, and I think that that's a very important thing to note, is that there is kind of that dark history between police and protesters here in Chicago at this very event. And so some of the directives that we've read from Chicago police, you know, kind of spell out that stand back and just watch type of environment, and that's very much what I know some of their training entailed as well. And so, you know, we even talked to some protesters off camera yesterday, and we had asked them how long they had been out here, as they were really kind of ripping and roaring here when we arrived. And they said, we've been out here for a couple of hours on the street corner. They had blocked the streets off, and the police were not kind of messing with that. It was a permitted protest, and in that email that I mentioned we got from Chicago police, there were about 4 or 5 permitted protests. And so police should be aware that everyone here has taken the necessary steps, at least for those ones that are permitted, and so we don't really expect too much trouble. And some of the rest of that Governor Pritzker interview that we just played a really short snippet of in that story, he kind of said the same thing, where he was saying, you know, we don't really expect anything to happen, but the police have received that special training. They're ready to respond to whatever may be the case. And I really think, but just based on looking at some of the protests, a lot of them are kind of pushed outside of the United Center area, and that was the case actually in Milwaukee as well at the RNC, to the point where there were lawsuits filed by protesters because they were pushed so far back from that Fiserv Forum Arena venue that they had to sue the city to get a little bit closer. We didn't see any of that here. It appears that Chicago is being very accommodating to these protests, but like I said, they are standing by and ready to respond to whatever they need to.
Yeah, that was kind of the argument, was, you know, how are you going to mount an effective protest when none of the delegates can actually see the protest because it's on the other side of town or in a park far away from the arena? What's interesting is you're not far from Milwaukee. I mean, when you look at it on the map, it's really the next city north as you go up I-94 there, you know, up to Milwaukee. They're both on Lake Michigan, obviously, but they couldn't be farther apart in terms of messaging. You know, the reason Atlanta News First is in Chicago is because Atlanta News First was in Milwaukee, and now you are there, Doug. What differences do you expect compared to what you saw at the Republican convention?
Yeah, well, Milwaukee is a much smaller city, obviously, compared to Chicago, and so I think that some of these road closures will have a little bit less effect on just the general public, the traffic of things. People here in Chicago, and I lived in Grand Rapids for almost a decade before I came to Atlanta, and so we visited Chicago often. Road closures, protests, permitted protests are really just kind of a thing here, and so I think life will kind of continue as normal for Chicagoans here while this goes on. Milwaukee was certainly a bit more of a disruptive presence because you were shutting down main roads when there are so many less of them in that city, and so you felt that security presence a whole lot more there than you did here. But those protesters really did their homework. A lot of the delegations, certainly the Georgia delegation, is staying right here on the river, not too far from the lake, at some of these hotels around the downtown area, and so they didn't need to go to the United Center to get the attention of delegates. We had to muscle our way through some of these crowds just to get to our hotel, and I assume that some of the delegates, some of the lawmakers, and some of the people who are in attendance at the DNC today also had to do the same. So I think, to be fair, it was a very good way to get some attention from some of the people that you wanted to get the attention of if you are these protesters, certainly.
Let's talk about what's going to go on inside the United Center. You know, Joy and I, right before your live shot came up, I'm not sure if you heard what we were talking about, was how difficult it's going to be, or the challenge at least, for Vice President Harris to thread that needle of being the candidate of the future when at the same time the standard bearers of the party all the way back to the 90s, and in the case of Joe Biden, the 1970s, are going to be addressing the convention. How are they going to sort of take that message of old and turn it into a new message?
Yeah, and that's a problem, right, for the Democrats, is they are they were, I think, more so in past years, the party of young voters and the party of certainly a much more mixed electorate than Republicans. But that certainly is changing now. We see that across the political board. And even some of the folks that we talked to at that protest yesterday were younger people who are having a hard time voting for Democrats because of how they've handled things like the economy, how they've handled things like foreign conflict, especially between Israel and Palestine. And so you have to message to these voters who are your lifeblood and your real base if you're Kamala Harris, and that's imperative. And I think the difference that we're going to hear, this is speculatory, but the difference that we're going to hear between the messaging at the RNC and the messaging at the DNC is going to be vast, because all we heard at the RNC was how bad things are going to be under a possible, at that point, Biden administration and now Harris administration. And I think here the message will be hopeful, looking forward and continuing some of the momentum that Biden has carried forward with some of his bigger things, the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, bringing down inflation finally under 3% now. And so that is what you're going to hear a lot of. You're not going to hear a lot of that negativity towards Donald Trump, I think, as much as you're going to hear about positivity for a potential Harris-Walz administration. That really is what I'm hearing from these delegates. They want to focus. You think back to Barack Obama's old campaign slogan of hope. I think that's kind of what they're playing off of a little bit here, whereas the Republicans were playing off of the doom and gloom of what the possibilities could be. Here at the DNC, I think you're going to hear about the hope that could come with a new administration. And certainly, I did hear what you and Joy were talking about earlier, and I couldn't agree more that there is a very fine line that Kamala Harris has to tread between equating some of her work as the vice president with some of Biden's work as president, and also at the same time distancing herself from some of the things that have really turned off a lot of these Democratic voters to wanting to vote for Biden in the first place. That's why we're here, right? That's why Harris has become the nominee. And so this will be interesting. We have a lot of great speakers tonight that are going to kind of lay that groundwork, including Biden himself. We're also going to hear from Representatives Jamie Raskin, Jasmine Crockett, and Senator Raphael Warnock from Georgia, who we're hoping to speak to either today or tomorrow. But this will be, I think, an interesting night to set the tone for things. Hearing from Biden, I think, on Monday was very calculated so that you put a little bit of distance between Biden on Monday and Harris speaking on Thursday, of course, with Barack Obama and Tim Walz in between, as well as Bill Clinton. So you're going to hear a lot of positivity, I think, at this year's DNC, and that again is speculatory, but that's just what I've been hearing from everyone here. That's what they want to hear.
Yeah, those are all good points. I do want to get your view on what you think of, what the party has to do to win this election, what the Democratic Party has to do. In terms of sort of what we saw in 2020, the whole election hinged on places like North Fulton County, places like the changing demographics of Cobb County and Gwinnett County and places like that. There were these voters who had voted for Trump before, who voted for Biden because, as they put it back then, democracy was on the ballot, so to speak. Those are the voters they have to win over again. The party or the partisans on both sides, they're not going to change their mind. You've got the Trump voters going to vote Trump. The dyed-in-the-wool Democratic voters are going to vote Democratic. But does it help the Democratic Party to have, somewhat polarizing figures like Hillary Clinton addressing tonight, to have Bill Clinton addressing, to have people speaking to the convention in prime time that turn off those swing independent voters, or could turn off those swing independent voters?
It's possible. It definitely is possible, because think about the dynamics here at play that led us to this point. People were fed up with the establishment. They were fed up with these really legacy Democratic candidates like Joe Biden, like Bill Clinton, and they wanted something new. And so in a sense, the Democratic Party has already done one of the best things that they could possibly do, which was to replace their candidate with someone who is younger, someone who is fresher, someone who has a little bit more diversity behind their name. Certainly, I mean, the energizing effect of Kamala Harris not only being one of the first women to lead a major party ticket, but also the first black woman to lead a major party ticket, is going to excite a lot of voters. I mean, just back in Atlanta, we've done stories with black community leaders who said, my constituents are finally now excited, my parishioners are finally now excited to vote for somebody that they believe in. And so they've already taken a big step towards energizing a lot of the base that was just kind of turned off to this and very apathetic about wanting to vote for someone who they didn't see themselves in. And so that's huge. And I think that that's something that you're going to hear a lot of is the diverse makeup of the Democratic Party. We talked to, just for example, one delegate from Gwinnett County, which is always an interesting place to see how votes play out there. Certainly wasn't 2020, who was 20 years old, and he was Latino, and he is, to our knowledge, the youngest Georgia Democrat to be a delegate. And so he said to us, my friends weren't excited to vote for Joe Biden. They are excited to vote for Kamala Harris. And so I really do think that they've already taken quite a big step here before this convention started in replacing Biden as the candidate. And so now you need to figure out what the issues are that are going to, as I said in that story, hemorrhage voters. Things like, excuse me, things like the conflict in Israel and Palestine. Those are the types of things that are going to polarize people and not make them come out. I think at this point it's not a matter of Democrats switching and voting Republican. It's a matter of Democrats not coming out at all. And we know the effects that can have. We saw, correct me if I'm wrong here, I'll throw out the number that I think is accurate, Brendan, but I think it was something like 70,000 Georgians voted Republican down ticket but did not vote for Donald Trump in 2020. And that was far more than the margin of victory for Joe Biden in our state. And so you really have to make people want to vote for that top of the ticket candidate, or else you're really going to have a tough time in places like Georgia that are going to have margins in the 10, maybe 20,000 vote range.
Yeah, you're so right. That 70,000 number is a lot bigger than 11,780 votes, which was the margin, or 11,779 votes, because nobody asked for one more vote on the call with Raffensperger. But there is another interesting point, and this is the only thing this is the only kind of content you get on Atlanta News First when streaming, because we can get down into this granular information. She's not just the first black female at the top of a major party ticket. She's also the first Southeast Asian candidate to lead a major party ticket. And why that's significant also just politically, forget all of the other things we can talk about, is you have a very large Indian population in the northern suburbs of Georgia, of Atlanta, I should say. So you have a very large and growing Indian population in South Forsyth, in North Fulton, in Cobb, and in Gwinnett. And those are, not to paint with too broad of a brush here, generally more conservative voters. And now they have a candidate that is going to, and nobody is saying that anybody votes for someone just because they share the same race as them, but it certainly makes someone take another look when they're the first candidate representing your community, where you can look in the, at the television and you see someone who looks like you running for a major party, running for president. Do you think that will have any impact, especially when you're talking about such narrow margins?
I do, and I'll just give you an example of why I think that's the case, because look at what happened in Michigan during the primary, where you had a large faction of Muslim voters voting uncommitted. Now, you could have the same effect in reverse, certainly in places like the ones you mentioned, where you're picking up votes. And again, when we're talking about 11,000 vote differentials in a state like Georgia, I think that makes all the difference, and it can go either way for you. And I think, like I said, people want to vote for someone they can see themselves in. That wasn't the case with a lot of Democratic voters in Georgia. And so I think now you've, like I said, taken a big step towards making people want to vote for you. And we'll see how that plays out, I suppose, in counties like South Forsyth.
Now, one thing you and I said when we did these live reports back during the Republican convention when you were in Milwaukee and I was standing at the same desk was about how well the Republican convention, went. This is sort of my last question for you before we let you go, Doug, is, do you think the Democrats can pull off the same thing the Republicans did, even though the effects of that have not been long-lasting for the GOP?
Yeah, I think that it's entirely possible. I think, give me the question one more time, Brendan. I'm sorry. We were just having a quick technical issue.
No, you're
just
no problem.
One more time.
That's how these things work. That's no problem. It's live television or live streaming. Do you think that the Democrats are capable of pulling off a similarly smooth convention like the Republicans did? But because by all accounts, even the Democrats said that the Republicans had a great convention.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, convention was the word I missed. I absolutely do. Keep in mind, by the way, that there was a good chance at one point that this was going to be held in Atlanta. They moved to Chicago because there was an offer from Governor J.B. Pritzker, who comes from a very wealthy family, to actually foot the bill for this convention. And so I think that they will have what they need. I think that they are very comfortable in this city. Actually, Trump Tower is right over my shoulder here, and there was a projection up there last night stating that Trump was responsible for Project 2025. So Democrats have a very strong presence in this city. Illinois is a very blue state, and so I think that they have everything they need to make this a very successful convention. They have the lineup of speakers certainly to entice a lot of folks who are watching on TV and make it exciting for them at home. And I guess the only thing we can do now is wait and see how right we're going to be.
That's right. Doug Reardon with Atlanta News First, our political reporter, live from Chicago. We'll see you all week. Do try to get some sleep. I know you did about 100 hours of OT last time, and so hopefully you're able to get some rest at least on when this is all over. And then we can just start rolling into November. Doug Reardon, Atlanta News First political reporter, thanks for joining us. And that's the story there. Thank you, Doug. And that's the story from Chicago, where Doug's a fantastic political reporter for Atlanta News First. He does see it right down the middle. He's able to to call hits, runs, and errors very fairly, and he's the person you want on the ground there. And so he's going to be doing an excellent job, and he's going to be joining us here live at 11 o'clock every day. And we're going to continue this all the way through Friday. Today's more of a preview, even though, and then Friday will be a complete wrap-up. So even though the convention ends Thursday night with Vice President Kamala Harris accepting the nomination of her party to be President of the United States, we are then going to wrap up on Friday and sort of say how it all went. We did this with the Republican convention. The Republican convention went extraordinarily smoothly. I mean, there was a lot of hand-wringing among the Democrats that this thing was over, and that they were going to. It was just a matter of how much they were going to lose by at that point. These were the discussions in back rooms. Don't fool yourself if you think that wasn't the case. And that is one of the reasons there was pressure on Joe Biden to drop out. And there's no question there was pressure, but by all accounts, he made the decision himself. And no one can force you to run for president, even though you were elected during the primary process. But as we pointed out earlier, the primary process, it is a democratic process, but it is choosing the nominee of a private political party. We tend to think of the Republicans and the Democrats as sort of enshrined in the Constitution, but there's no mention of political parties in the U.S. Constitution at all. There's only some very basic requirements to run for president. There are requirements on state ballots, and that's pretty much the only place you see Republicans and Democrats actually enumerated in law, because those two political parties basically get their places saved in most states on the ballot. They don't have to qualify for the ballot by a certain date with a certain number of signatures like third party or non-party candidates for president have to. And so basically the Republicans and Democrats in some states quite literally just tell the secretaries of state or whoever administers the elections in those states who their nominee is. Even though it's already been decided, they can do so at the convention. In fact, I was at the Republican convention in Cleveland back in 2016 when there was a very aggressive effort by the Never Trumpers to unseat Trump, even though he had won all the primaries. And they were close. I mean, not razor thin close, but there was an effort to basically force a floor vote to replace the nominee. And that would have been entirely within the rules of the Republican Party, just as the process for selecting Kamala Harris is entirely within the rules of the Democratic Party. What the Republicans are doing right now, and I think Donald Trump is doing rather effectively, is painting this as undemocratic. What he's saying is, hey, look, why did all these Democrats go to the polls and cast ballots during these primaries if in the end the party can just pick whomever they want anyway? Well, it actually does turn out that just like with the Electoral College, you don't vote for president, you vote for a slate of electors. With the party primaries, you're actually not voting for a candidate, you're voting for their slate of delegates to the convention. And those delegates are free once the candidate drops out to cast their ballots for whomever they choose. And actually, the Joe Biden slate of delegates, almost all of them, the vast majority of them voted for Kamala Harris. I think one of the things that really surprised political operatives, because, by all accounts, Kamala Harris has not been the most visible vice president. It's not that she doesn't have a record to run on, it's that most people haven't seen her for the last 4 years. Now, that's often the job of vice president, is to, do the assignment that the president gives you, and, don't take the spotlight away from the top, the person at the top of the job, the president of the United States, who was then going to run for re-election. But what surprised everybody was just how quickly Kamala Harris jumped in when Joe Biden dropped out, and not that she would want the job or that she would lobby for the job, but how quickly she was able to coalesce support around her candidacy. And, you had Barack Obama, bringing it back to Chicago, with the convention. You had Barack Obama, the former president of the United States, and Michelle Obama both saying, no, we're not endorsing her, even though she's a friend of ours. We believe this should be an open convention, or at least, some sort of process with like a rushed speed dating primary. That quickly changed. Barack Obama, within a few days, came back and said, no, I've changed my mind. Everybody coalesced support around Kamala Harris, and that was who's responsible for that? It's Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris was able to put together this coalition of support so quickly that it kind of was like an interview for the job, if you think about it, because what do you have to do as president of the United States? You have to act quickly during times of crisis, and when things that happen unexpectedly, you have to be decisive, and then you have to get support of the people you're going to need to pull off what it is you're trying to do. There's no question that Kamala Harris was able to do that. And she's right now, effectively on the campaign trail. She is essentially arguing that, hey, look, all the things you like about the economy, yeah, I was right there, with the Biden-Harris administration. Those things you don't like, yeah, I wasn't really responsible for those. And look, everybody does that, even with their own record. You sort of try to accentuate the things that you think have gone right and sort of distance yourself from things that have gone wrong. She's been mischaracterized as the border czar. She never had that title, although she was assigned duties, by the president to take care of the border situation. Immigration and immigration reform certainly are going to be a big part of this campaign. It already is. Those issues are already front and center. And those are the issues that the Republicans are pushing heavily. What they're having problems with right now in the Republican side is keeping Donald Trump on message. What they want to do is hammer away, are you better off now than you were under the Donald Trump administration? So 4 years ago, they point out that gas prices were incredibly low, like $1.13 a gallon. When Donald Trump left office. What they leave out is that we were in the middle of a pandemic, and literally the whole world stopped driving. I mean, the globe parked their cars and didn't go to work, and cities were abandoned. That tends to lower energy demand, which then lowers prices. That wasn't, the fault, or I should say the credit of Donald Trump. So people forget sort of, same thing was George W. Bush. Gas prices were incredibly low when he left office, but of course, that was the 2008 stock market crash and the Great Recession, as they called it. So you got J.D. Vance out there on the campaign trail. He's sort of the everyman. They're going to be campaigning and already are. In fact, they're counter-programming the convention, which is a big change from tradition. It used to be that the opposing party during the convention would sort of just let them have their week. So the Republicans would let the Democrats have their week, and the Democrats would let the Republicans have their week, and they would have a very small schedule, if any public appearances at all during the opposing party's convention. That is not the case. J.D. Vance, barnstorming, particularly the swing states, particularly the Rust Belt and the upper Midwest. You have Donald Trump doing the same thing. Donald Trump's going all the way from Arizona to Michigan to all over. So you do have them counter-programming the convention, and they're going to be trying to steal a little bit of thunder away. The other thing, expect to see Donald Trump say some things in speeches, because he has been off message. He has been talking about whether Kamala Harris is even qualified, not qualified to do the job, but even qualified to be on the ballot, questioning all sorts of things that sometimes demand a response from the other side. And so you're going to have Donald Trump saying things that the Democrats are going to have to decide whether or not they address those at their convention or whether they just ignore them. That's the dynamic that's set up right now in Chicago. Again, sort of finishing where we began. You can go back to 1968 when the Democrats had their convention. These were not identical conditions at all, but they say, I forget who said, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. You've got a president stepping down who could have run for re-election in 1968. Same thing happening here. You've got people protesting in the streets and the Chicago police having to, sort of rein that in. And then you have what could have been an open convention that was short-circuited by Kamala Harris's congealing of support and getting, consolidating that to actually have the nomination wrapped up before the convention. So that's where we're heading tonight. You're going to see Joe Biden take the stage, the President of the United States addressing the convention. It's going, his first convention, 1972. This is likely to be his last convention, at least for some time. Because he's in the twilight of his life, and he's certainly in the twilight of his political career. And then you've got Jill Biden also speaking tonight, and Hillary Clinton. That begins the convention, and it all is going to end with Kamala Harris accepting the nomination on Thursday night. Every day you'll be able to see us right here at 11 o'clock. We're going to be doing this live streaming report. You'll see Doug Reardon, and we'll also have political commentators other than myself giving you sort of a play-by-play of what happened the night before and what's coming up next. And we're also going to be having full coverage on Atlanta News First on all of our newscasts. I'll be on every night at 7 o'clock with a political story, and we'll have that all the way through Thursday. And we're going to be covering this left, right, and center. But what we're always going to be doing is giving you the truth. We're in the truth business. We don't pick one side or the other, and we're going to call it like we see it, and we're going to bring on balanced reporting throughout. I'm Chief Investigator Brendan Keefe. Before we go, we do want to ask you to share your thoughts on the convention, and you can do so by texting this number, 470-777-WANF. That's 9263. Just text DNC, and once you text DNC, then you can share your message, and you then can tell us what you think about the convention. Tell us what you want the candidates to address, whether you think they've been effective, whether you think Kamala Harris should be at the top of the ticket or not, whether you think she is going to prevail over Donald Trump. Again, the number there on your screen, text DNC. And we will then see your comments and share some of them as well right here on Atlanta News First Plus. And I am Chief Investigator Brendan Keefe with Atlanta News First Investigates. This concludes our live stream here today. We do want to send you off in just a few minutes to our noon newscast, which is on Atlanta News First. You can also see that streaming on atlantanewsfirst.com. And we're going to bring that graphic up for you just before we leave. And so you can sort of see what we're going to be bringing to you at noon. But that concludes our live stream right now. If you guys want to pop me back up real quick. Oh, there it is. Democratic National Convention special coverage. Just in time. Nick of time. That's our special coverage we're going to be having every day here streaming 11 to noon. Sometimes we'll go all the way to noon, but today is just a preview. So we're going to leave you there. Again, signing off, I am Chief Investigator Brendan Keefe, Atlanta News First Investigates.